Thank you, Michael. I really do appreciate the introduction. And, I've really had a great opportunity to get to meet you and hear a little bit more about WorkProud. And even last week when we did the CHRO Summit in Dallas, really getting to know your team. And so, really interested in, first letting you guys know a little bit about who I am. Sometimes you have speakers that come up and, as Michael said, they're here to sell a product or they're here to sell a service. And ultimately what I'm looking to do is upskill my peer leaders in the field, those that are working HR, that are the HR practitioners who are out there trying to figure out every day, how do we become more productive? How do I become more strategic? How do I make sure I'm more innovative within my role? But before I do that, let me kind of give you a little bit of who I am so you know credibility, right? And I love this slide because it shows the loves of my life on it, right? So here, this first picture, the biggest picture, because it's the most important to me. You see my beautiful wife and you see my beautiful daughter, and that is Adrian and Millie. And so why I do this every single day, and man, that picture really makes me smile because she's just so naturally happy in it. I also share, this beautiful picture of the beach and these seagulls because I'm from Tampa, Florida. That's where I live. I lived here for 20 years. I spent some time traveling to other areas, Bentonville, Arkansas, when I worked for Walmart, down in South Florida for a little bit when I worked in strategy and innovation. But, I let this reflect a little bit on who I am. And the next two pictures really are, around technology. And so how did I get to where I am today? How did I become this, this person who understands ChatGPT or generative AI, and how do we utilize AI functions effectively within the HR space? And, it really goes back to some of my experiences when I worked with Target, and we had different captainships that we had, and I was a captain of our technology partnerships. It comes to some of the integrations that we did at Walmart when we implemented Workday and how we did that throughout the organization. And I really identified, that technology is so important within the HR space. And not just technology, but even what is the foundation of how generative AI and AI become so impactful, and that's data and analytics. And so that has been a really, really important impact to me because I've seen how it's changed the HR workforce, how it's changed the way that we can go from changing HR from really being that, tactical, transactional role that is in the past to somebody who's transformational, somebody who really actualizes the goals and objectives of organizations through its people and through its policies and through its processes. And on there, you also see the QR code. If you take a picture of that, that will take you to my LinkedIn profile. I'll have that QR code at the end of this as well. And, that's just there to reach out to me. If I can help you in any way as you learn things today, as you begin to integrate AI and ChatGPT and generative AI into your daily activities, whether it's personally and professionally, or you have questions about how to do that even, I'm here for you. And that's what I'm here for, is to how do we upskill, the attendees here today in HR throughout the country. And so here's what I want to make sure you guys understand. We've got some goals here today. And what really, makes me different than those that we've talked about is, I'm sure many people here maybe already attended a training on AI or ChatGPT. Maybe this is your first time. And a lot of times you hear people talk about hypotheticals. Here's what it can do, or here's what the future holds. And that's great, because the future is going to be amazing. I mean, what we've done in the last year, what I'm training on today is very different than what I trained on a year ago. And it's amazing where we're going to go, but you have to understand where we're at today. And so I want to talk about AI as a building block for HR innovation and strategy, understand where we're at, how we got here with AI, maybe give you some perspective and insight into that. But I also want to talk about those real world challenges and solutions, right? Not where can we go, but what can you do today to be more productive? What can you do today to be more impactful, to reduce the administrative burden to the HR function? And then finally, we'll go through some of the questions and discussion around that we've seen, some of the themes and trends of the questions that were pre-submitted. And then at the end, we'll open it up to additional questions, right? You're going to hopefully learn some things today. And I hope you have some insight where you're like, well, man, what about this? Or how can we use it that way? And I'm here to help guide you. What I will tell you is I'm not a tech expert. I don't have a degree in IT or, computer engineering or anything like that. My degree was in political science, and was very thankful to get a second degree in healthcare administration, since that's where I've really focused my careers in healthcare. But I've learned everything about generative AI and AI through using it, through asking it questions, through asking it to teach me. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of what AI does, and especially generative AI, is it reduces those barriers to education. Even though it costs $20 a month, imagine if you were able to teach yourself anything you wanted for $20 a month. And that's truly the capacity of what this tool could do. And I'm excited to talk about that today. So I love this quote, and I think it maybe ages me a little bit, or at least people can see the generation I'm in, because The quote is from the co-founder of MTV, Tom Freston. And what it says is innovation is taking two things that exist and putting them together in a new way. Now, that was radio and TV, right? We had these music videos. Everybody loved it. MTV's still around today because of that innovation. Now, they might not show as many music videos as they used to, but that was a really innovative technology, a really innovative jump back then. And that's really important to call out because where we're at with AI is nothing new. AI has been around since the 80s, since the 90s, but it's just become more and more prevalent and it's changed. It's advanced. It's become smarter. As we start to get to what is general intelligence, right now we're at artificial intelligence. We're in this really awesome wave because now we have this generative AI. And what does that mean? What is generative AI? Generative AI is really content generation. It's not usually coming up with something new. It's also not really rehashing anything, but it's giving you the answers to the questions you seek, usually the right answers. But it takes some work, right? And that's still not new in and of itself. When you're on Outlook or you're on Gmail and it starts to finish your sentences, guess what? That's AI. That's generative AI. Whenever you're on your text and it's starting to finish your text, that's generative AI. I like to point back and talk about Microsoft Word sometimes because now Microsoft has Copilot and these extra tools. If you remember Clippy, when you start doing something, it's like, hey, Clippy the little thing that would pop up in Microsoft Word. It was all really annoying. We all know. I don't know anybody that actually enjoyed Clippy, but Clippy was AI, right? But the surge of popularity this year in AI as we become more and more, aware of it, is really because of generative AI. And this is nothing new in itself because, in the last 4 to 5 years, what you've really heard about in the HR space is data and analytics. How are you using people data? How are you using people analytics to take actionable insights and do something with them? And so the foundation of what we're doing with generative AI is based on the same thing, the data and the analytics. That's why you hear things about copyright infringement or challenges to how generative AI is getting the information that it creates. But the power of it is based on the collective knowledge of the internet, the collective studies, all these things that are out there to help you answer those questions. And it's still going to be new in terms of how we use it with ChatGPT, but it's being integrated into the things that you do every single day. Sentiment analysis, when you're using Qualtrics or whatever engagement platform you have, that's AI. Listening to what people say and being able to generate what that means, that's AI. When you think about how you're utilizing it with LinkedIn, nowadays you go put a post on LinkedIn and it says, hey, do you need some help with AI to write this post? It's being integrated into every single thing that we do. And it's starting to become difficult to figure out what's AI or what's AI supported versus what's genuine from somebody that you talk to, right? I mean, most of us are probably on LinkedIn. I would say that I can tell nowadays that more than half of the posts that you see are typically people who are using AI to write those posts, especially if they're salespeople. And when you get those emails that are automated, especially when you get one on Christmas and you're like, that's funny, this is 30 days after you wrote me and it's an email on Christmas. Are you working on Christmas? No. It's an automated platform that's using generative AI to create these sales approaches. And so we see it every single day. And sometimes it's easy to identify and sometimes it's not. But that's going to be what's interesting is how do we navigate that over we navigate the future. And so I want to talk a little bit about the use cases for AI within the HR field. This comes from Gartner, and you'll notice I'll reference Gartner a couple times throughout the day because they've just released their Future of Work study. And I think it's a great resource to be able to understand where are we going. And really, when you look at the use case prism for human capital management, and I hate calling it human capital, but that's what they call it. There's everything from performance feedbacks to bias detection to skills management. And really, it's going to be based on two things. What's the value that you bring to the business? How are you helping move the business forward in an innovative fashion that achieves the results, the goals and objectives, the strategic plan, whatever it is you have within your organization that's going to be the most impactful? And then what's the feasibility? That's really important to call out because what we'll talk about here on this next slide as you look at some of those options of how you can use it within the HR function is that you have to figure out the feasibility because you have to either build or buy when you're deploying generative AI. And now one thing I want to call out here is this is a slide that talks about how do you actually deploy it as an HR leader. After you establish the vision, the priorities, the budget, the principles of what you're trying to decide, you can figure out if you want to decide to buy a tool or if you want to build a tool. It probably depends on the size of your organization. If you're an HR department of one, which there's a lot of you out there, it's going to be really hard to build your generative AI platforms because it's complex. It's expensive. It takes technical aptitude that you might not have in an organization with 50, 200, 500, or 1,000 employees. But I think what we call out here is that you really have to pull the right stakeholders together to discuss, where are we trying to go with AI? How can it bring business value? And what's the feasibility of how we can incorporate that into our business? Now, I'll call out, there's some organizations out there that are huge, that have done a great job. One example is Walmart. They have their own, chatbot GPT function that, from what I've told, has been pretty effective. Zillow has done the same thing. But I think it's important to figure out what kind of organization you are and where you want to be. And then you can decide, what are the key approaches to how you're going to deploy generative AI if you decide to, or do you just want to use the tools already out there like ChatGPT? Because it's a very easy tool to use. It's very inexpensive. They now offer enterprise edition, so you can collaborate between your team members. But what's the simplest way? Well, the simplest way to deploy AI is through consuming, right? It's when you take this approach as an out-of-the-box approach. It might be something that your existing HR technology provider already has. For example, if you use some kind of engagement survey analysis and it provides you sentiment analysis. If you use a rewards and recognition platform, and every time you click into it, it says, how are you feeling today? And it gives you a really angry face to a really happy smiley face, allowing you to make day-to-day decisions on the sentiment of your workforce, right? There might be these out-of-the-box generative AI capabilities that are already instituted within the technologies that you use. The second is the embedding. It's still using tools that are out of the box, right? But what that does is it embeds within a browser plugin, or you have a widget that's on your computer. It's something that is basically accessing the capabilities of generative AI within the platforms that you already have, your HR applications that you already have. Now, those tend to be the easiest. They tend to be the ones that seem most relevant for HR, especially because we're using SaaS platforms and we're using tools. But then you start to get really technical, right? Extending via data retrieval, which is called retrieval augmented generation. That's your Microsoft Copilot, right? It's an out-of-the-box capability that they provide, but if you don't have that out-of-the-box capability, it can be very costly and complex technical architecture. The fine-tuning, this is what we really hear about, and though it's highly complex, this is what we talk about when we're talking about fine-tuning, when you say, how do you build it on your own policies? How do you build it on the ontology of your ERPs like Monday or ADP? How do you build it on your payroll systems? How do you build it on your engagement systems? How do you build it on your rewards and recognition platforms? How do you bring all of these tools and resources that you have together, along with the data warehouse that you have, and create this ontology that you can now build predictive models to be able to drive effectiveness? And then finally, if you're a large company, one of those Fortune 500s possibly that has a huge workforce in technology, you might be able to build custom foundational models. But I will tell you, probably not something that you're going to see in the HR functions, because they are very costly and they are very complex. And so as you'll hear today, we'll probably talk about those that are more on the consume and the embed. Michael, I think we jump into questions, right? So
that was a great introduction and scene setter for us. Thank you. And there are some organization of the thoughts and questions that Stephen has helped put together. And I'm going to then pepper in with some of the questions that people are posting either through the real life chat or submitted earlier. But so let's sort of begin, given that this is an HR orientated population we're starting with. There's a lot of questions around application risks and opportunity. Where should there be a level of anxiety, if that's an appropriate term, and where conversely is the anxiety just a different word for an opportunity? How should HR people be thinking about the potential dangers and/or then, if it's related, the opportunities to capitalize?
I think it's a great question, right? And there's probably people in the room today that are saying, how is AI going to affect my team? How's it going to affect my own job? And how's it going to affect the entire HR landscape? And, honestly, it's a lot to take in, right? Especially at the speed of which it's been delivered, especially with everything that we hear on the news every single day. And, first off, what I would like to say is, I found this study through Gartner. It's not surprising to find that, they talk about employee anxiety that's going to replace by job function. So marketing and public relations, really high on that list, but along with human resources. And why is that, right? Well, with generative AI, it's a content generation machine. It can generate content for you. It can generate answers for you. And so with marketing and public relations, think about all the people who work in social media. Think about how they develop these social media strategies, these employment branding strategies, how they have to create the content, the blog post, all of these things. Well, that's what ChatGPT and generative AI does really well. It generates product. And so human resources, I think it's important to call out that they're up there with marketing public relations at 42%. And that's a really scary thing to think about, because what's really important about human resources is the human element. And I'll talk about that here in a second. But one of the things I want to call out, and what I'll ride onto with this next slide, is it talks a little bit about the statistics of what's going on in the workforce around the anxiety around AI. But with any healthy change management, mitigating anxiety starts with communication. We know that the rumors about AI can run wild, right? From somebody who's on a customer service team to even, doctors who are saying, hey, here's all the information about a patient in a HIPAA compliant environment. Can you create a patient care plan? So as people leaders, it's important to be the voice of clarity when there's a sea of uncertainty, right? So think about how you can openly discuss the upcoming changes with your teams. Think about how you gain leadership buy-in to make sure that your company isn't just introducing AI in something like project management, where we're just dropping it on our teams, but let's talk about it and explain the benefits. On my team alone, we've talked about using Monday, which has a lot of AI built into it in the form of automation. And what that automation does is it reduces the administrative burden to my team. We utilize it as a talent acquisition platform in which somebody submits a job, it updates onto our dashboard with all the information that's necessary. The candidates will be added by the recruiters as they move them into the right process. It notifies the right people about an interview taking place. When somebody accepts an offer, it notifies it. Because we work in healthcare, once they've accepted that offer, it moves them to a credentialing board. It creates all of this through automation. And so teams might be a little bit worried, like, well, if you're taking all of this work off my plate, what happens to my job? But it's important for us, and I kind of look to the right here because I have my screen up. It's important for us to make sure that we're communicating with our teams. It's not just about easing the fears. It's about setting the stage for a smoother transition, how we upskill our team. And on the topic of skill development, and that's something clearly we're all passionate about, or you wouldn't be here today. You have Gen AI coming in. That's a huge opportunity to upskill our teams. Imagine being the HR team, and whether you own training or workforce development, working with your leadership team, working with your IT teams, application teams, and offering those workshops that turn AI into a tool, not a threat. It's like giving everyone on your team a superpower tailored to their specific roles. And I think that's really important to call out, because as you look at some of these stats, my organization's recommended I develop specific skills to prepare for technology that may impact my role. They've communicated their plans. These are well under 50%. And in fact, some of the stats in this study also talk about how many HR practitioners or HR leaders have even rolled the use of generative AI and AI as a tool within their resources out to their teams effectively. But listen, here's what we know. As HR leaders, we believe in one thing, that people are our biggest asset. And that's not going to change with AI. In fact, it becomes even more true because of AI. So we have to show our teams how their creativity, their insights, these are the things that AI can't replicate. For instance, you've probably heard, if you work in talent acquisition, that AI can handle basic recruitment functions like resume matching or sentiment analysis and video interviews, but it's the human touch, the employee understanding of the cultural and manager needs that makes the difference and allows us to be an asset to the organization. And on that topic, think about it. Generative AI is really exciting. Mentioning opportunities to work in a cutting edge AI environment is a big draw to candidates. It's about showcasing that you're not just utilizing technology to reduce administrative burdens, but you're a forward-thinking organization. And so going back to that communication strategy, it's time to be transparent. Even if we don't have the answers about generative AI today, we have to let's share what we know we can to help support our teams. In this instance, I think it's better to over communicate than leave room for speculation, because there's plenty of people out there who are wondering, what's next? Am I going to Is this going to replace my job? And there probably are jobs that it will replace. But by doing so, it becomes more about guiding and supporting and empowering our teams through an AI journey where we turn generative AI from a source of anxiety into a source of innovation and growth.
So on that and following that thinking, Stephen, before you go forward, is where would some of our listeners start to educate themselves? What would be a step of logical sequential journeys to be then a voice that can advocate for it or potentially recommend implementations or methods within HR, especially given that that was your background? Where would people begin if we're starting with newbies on, if you're starting from scratch?
It's a fantastic question. There's a couple tools of what I've used, right? The first and foremost, I'm going to tell you, you can use ChatGPT to teach you ChatGPT, right? Now, ChatGPT is one type of generative AI out there, but it's probably the one that we hear about the most because it moves so quickly. And I'll tell you, in my functional trainings that I do for organizations and for companies, what I'm training on today is head and shoulders different from what I trained on a year ago, right? You now have custom chatbots that you can create. Whereas before they had an app store, really all of that is now built into ChatGPT. You now have an enterprise edition, right? So where do you start? I mean, first, engineer, ask ChatGPT, how can I prompt engineer effectively within an HR function? And it'll give you the answers that you seek. I think that's one of the coolest things about ChatGPT specifically is that you can teach yourself these tools. You don't have to have somebody like myself come in and teach you. Now, it's a little bit easier because I come and I speak from experience and I can show that. But you don't have to have that. The other way is, and this is one of the ways that I've done it, is I've signed up for a number of weekly kind of emails that come out, like newsletters, to keep me up to date on what is such a fast moving technology and how it's changing and how it's growing and how it's impacting and examples of prompt engineering. I follow some really great people. Connor Grennan, who's the dean of the NYU School of Students. He's a fantastic resource to follow on LinkedIn. He posts every day in genuine content, not ChatGPT generated content, about how these tools are being utilized, not just in HR, but in sales and in marketing. And he and I presented together, and he's a fantastic resource. And in fact, there's a LinkedIn learning that he's done specific to generative AI. And so, how do you get started? Use the tools. Find a way to innovate it yourself. Start using it. Start asking it questions. Start finding ways when you get stuck to go, how do I use ChatGPT in this situation, right? The other day, I had somebody on my team who was having issues with an Excel prompt, and it wasn't pulling for something they were doing. And I go, well, give me the prompts that you have, and let's go put it in ChatGPT and figure out what the problem is. And within 1 minute, it said, here are 3 things to choose. And the second 3 things that might be a solution. And the second one was the fix. Now, she could have tried to search the internet for 25, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, trying to get the thing that's perfect for her situation. But these tools are built on the collective knowledge of everything that's on the internet. And there is a lot out there. This is not 1996 where it just started and we're sort of looking at, GeoCities trying to figure out things. This is 2024. The knowledge of the internet is insurmountable. We could never learn everything, but ChatGPT has. And so ask it questions. Find thought leaders to follow. I wouldn't consider myself a thought leader. I would just consider myself somebody who's really interested, but I post about it quite frequently. Caveat, I do use ChatGPT to help me with that. But find the thought leaders. Go out there and find it, because ultimately, if you're in an organization where you're trying to lead in innovation, you're trying to lead in how you use AI or generative AI, you're going to need to be able to bring along your legal team, your regulatory team, your compliance team. And then guess what? You're going to have to bring on your executive leaders. And to be able to do that, you're going to have to be able to show the value of the tool so that you can get them to buy in. And once you do that, I think you've got a wonderful runway in front of you.
I have one more question I'd like to ask, particularly given your healthcare background, and there was a number of healthcare-related attendees submitting questions. Future state: nurse has a patient exhibiting the following symptoms. Let's just add, for the sake of color, that the physician on staff at, let's say, rural hospital is not available. Are we anticipating a inquiry being submitted by a nurse going, I don't know what to do, and there's a response, or that's a little different, could be,
Yeah.
but that's different. How would you, react to at least telling the picture to us of the stages and phases that we may experience over the next 3-5 years?
I think that we're well on the way to that. Now, I would probably caution in doing that in ChatGPT because of HIPAA regulations, right? You want to make sure that you're not violating HIPAA because it's very expensive for every instance that you do that. And in fact, the company I worked for previously, they banned the use of ChatGPT altogether. They blacklisted it on the website so that our physicians couldn't go on there and put in private patient information in an effort to figure out how to do care plans. But there's no difference in using a tool that's built on the collective knowledge of how doctors are trained to help them create care plans than a doctor going and opening a book and talking about a certain condition and figuring out what that is. The difference is, I think it's going to be built in to your EHR systems, your systems like Epic. It's going to be built into there where it will protect patient information. It'll protect the data warehouse that you have of that patient information while enhancing a doctor's ability to drive results. And what that does is it allows them to spend more time building the trust with that patient, building the relationship with that patient, because it doesn't matter if you give a patient a care plan if they don't trust that you have the best interest in mind for them. And so where's that going? I mean, it's a science. If you have this type A, then the answer is answer B, right? And so it's very clear. And so I think we'll see that happen very soon. But I think there's been a recent example where a woman and her son, they had been to many doctors and they couldn't figure out what was wrong. And I don't remember the exact details of it because it's been a few months now. But she put in the chat GPT all of the conditions, everything that had happened. And it was able to identify after she'd been to many specialists that who couldn't figure out what it was, what that condition was so that her son could get healthy, so that they could address the condition her son was in. And that's just a little piece of what is possible utilizing generative AI. Because as humans, we only use whatever small percentage of our brain, but we have this tool that's going to allow us to expand that. That's going to allow us to be able to use the knowledge that we have and the knowledge that we don't have to be better servants and better stewards of our professions.
All right, over to you.
Yeah.
So organizational is the next sort of area and category. What's the general constructs for where this is going to apply to organizational impact and effectiveness? And then I can drill into some of the specific questions that people had asked.
Yeah, of course, of course. Well, one of the things I like to do is give a good comparison here, right? And that comparison is that back in the either late 70s or early 80s, NASA was trying to figure out for their astronauts when they went up to the space station or when they were in one of their lunar landings or whatever it may be, how can they develop a pen that their astronauts could write with, right? Because we know that pens use gravity, and that's how the ink flows to that paper. And they kept trying to figure out, how do we use this? We don't have gravity in zero gravity space. How do we make this work? And what they recognized is that they looked over at the Soviets who were doing the same thing. They didn't need a pen. They were using a pencil, right? And so that goes back to, how do we utilize this technology, whether you embed it, whether you consume it, whether you build your own. Sometimes you don't need the most expensive option. And I think within HR functionality, there's a lot of ways that we can use that tool, whether it's consuming what's already built out of the box or whether it's utilizing ChatGPT. But ChatGPT is the pencil in this analogy, right? You don't have to pay for these expensive things. I mean, imagine just a few years ago, HR professionals were swamped with the usual employee inquiries, heaps of paperwork, the never-ending challenge of everyone staying engaged and productive, right? I mean, that sounds familiar to everything that we're doing today. It hasn't changed too much. But things like communications, policy development, job descriptions, interview guides, I'm going to pop here the next slide for you, employment branding, social media, performance management. I mean, there's a list of things that enable people leaders to really easily use ChatGPT to address these things, to be supportive. And to be fair, utilizing it effectively is more than just doing it for work stuff. The more you use the tool, the more you innovate with it, the better you are. I'll tell you, I don't just use it professionally, I use it personally. A prime example is I showed you that picture of my beautiful 5-year-old daughter, Millie, earlier, right? She can sometimes be sassy. I might have given her a little too much confidence. And there are times where we try to use this, what they call gentle parenting technique, where I will try to gentle parent. I don't know what to do. So I asked ChatGPT, so here's what I've done. Here's the situation. Here's what my daughter has said to me. Tell me some things about how I can be a better parent. How can I mitigate these behaviors? And it's the same thing with HR functionalities, right? Except the beauty of the story is it's not a once upon a time scenario. It's happening right now in organizations across the world and possibly even in some of yours, right? The question is, how can we as HR leaders harness the full potential of AI and ChatGPT to make impactful and positive changes in our organizations? So here's some ways, right? Writing job descriptions. I mean, job descriptions are such a bane sometimes, and they're so boring. And so we can take ChatGPT and generate well-written, engaging job descriptions, crafting job postings that aren't just rewriting the job description, but maybe they utilize your employer value proposition to sell the position, to talk about what you do so well as an organization that attracts your top talent and how you can market the positions to attract that same top talent that you want to keep in your organization, right? Something that's compelling. If I've got an organization here in Florida, I might want to talk about the weather. I might want to talk about the beaches right down the road, right? Because somebody who's in Nebraska might be like, you know what, that's looking pretty nice right now here in January when it's cold. And so, how do you leverage that? So, you're not just posting a job description to attract talent, but you're leveraging it to attract the talent to you. One of the best ways that I love utilizing it is, and I actually saw somebody that I used to do some consulting with on this call. And so, I appreciate some of the people I know personally that have joined. But, he and I used to write really good interview guides using behavioral based interviewing. We'd sit down and we would talk about the leadership capabilities of what would success look like in that position. And we'd say customer service or driving accountability or driving for results or, building effective teams. We would utilize these to say, how do we create a job interview guide that uses behavioral based interviewing to find the best candidate for this job based on this job? And so ChatGPT is great at that because I would provide 20 examples of questions that we could use and probing questions and it took time to think about it. It took time to research those things. Now you can pop a job description into ChatGPT. You can pop a company profile into ChatGPT and say, here are the 4 or 5 leadership competencies based on Korn Ferry or whatever program you have, and help us come up with, and here's a good example of how to utilize effectively, 20 behavioral based questions that will allow us to evaluate customer orientation or motivating and inspiring others. And this is a good example of how you can utilize it effectively, right? Never just ask it for one result. Treat it like an intern. Give it as much information as you can, the company profile, the job description, the leadership competencies that you're evaluating. Give it as much information as you can, like you would an intern. Ask it for multiple examples, right? Don't just give me one question, give me 20. And then let me take 5 that I like and say, give me 20 more like those 5. Because you're never going to get the right answer from it. Well, very rarely are you going to get the right answer from it in the very first prompt that you make. And just like an intern, you need to give it feedback, ask it for options. You need to make sure you give it as much information as you can. But when you do that, you can create really effective interview guides in a small amount of time that's going to let you leverage your interviewers to not only attract through these job postings and well-written job descriptions, but also select the best talent that's out there. In the same thing in recruiting and onboarding, sometimes we have to make sure that we keep those candidates warm. How are we generating an email or generating a call script, or how are we generating a strategy for a hiring manager that might not be touchy-feely? That just says, well, I offered them a position 3 months ago. I'm expecting that they're starting next week, but I haven't talked to them in 3 months. It's not how it works. Now with today's generation, you got to stay in touch with them. You got to bring them along with you. And so you can build those onboarding plans, whether it's onboarding checklists, whether it's how you recognize them as being a new hire, or just making sure that they smoothly integrate into their new role through training. So those are some good examples in recruiting and onboarding, but HR is not just recruiting and onboarding. Providing feedback, when I do my trainings where we really go through how to utilize technology here, one of the things that usually clicks for people is when I talk about providing feedback. Because what we do is I say, we utilize StrengthsFinder or 16 personalities or whatever it may be, and we have this feedback specific to an employee. And here's some of the statements that we've got from people about this feedback. And now I need to create a scenario guide or kind of walk me through the best practices of how I'm going to have this conversation with this employee who maybe has an ENTJ personality. I myself am an ENTJ, so I'm very logical driven. I want to drive the solution, very kind of like type A. But how I approach that person is going to be very different than somebody who's more introverted. somebody who needs a more empathetic approach. And so when we do functional training, it's always a really good opportunity to show this through prompt engineering to say, here's how I would approach this person for this scenario, but I made a mistake. Actually, this person is this type of personality. And not only how would you change the way that you approach it, but why? Because I oftentimes get questioned, hey, with ChatGPT, is this going to dumb down society? We're just giving people answers. And the answer is no. Because just like I use it in improving my communication, I have to look at it, I have to read it, I have to provide it feedback. And so it teaches me how to communicate more effectively because I'm listening and understanding and digging into it. Just like I would in providing feedback, I want to understand the whys behind those decisions, the whys behind those approaches, so that I can enable my leaders to be stronger people leaders. Very simply, it can help you with documentation. I mean, we all know in HR that two of the most important things are consistency and documentation. And so how do you make sure that the documentation is appropriate? How do you make sure that it's clear on the expectations? And some of these other ones, 360 feedback, it's very much like sentiment analysis, employee development. Some of the challenges that people have is really developing what the plans are for their growth and development. And so this is a really great opportunity to be able to leverage data to really aid in the entire employee lifecycle, from attraction, when we're bringing them into the organization, to selection and assessment, to performance management and talent development. And so these are real ways that you can use this today through effective prompt engineering. And I post about these things on LinkedIn, so feel free to follow me there to find out more about these too.
So let's take a real world case study example for a moment before we come to the next one. Let's say we want to improve the feedback processes at our organization. We use ABC HRIS system for some recording of information, and we would like to give prompts to managers to follow your hypothetical. In layman's terms, what are the steps that we may take to capitalize on the capabilities that AI offer without getting too ambitious that it becomes too complicated? What would be a way we could explore that?
Well, and I think this goes back to the pen versus pencil technology, right? You got to use what works for you. And so one of the things that I will call out here is that people oftentimes have consideration of whether the information that's being provided to ChatGPT is private. And, I will tell you, I don't know the answer to that question. But what I do know is that oftentimes when you put information into a prompt and you get 20, 30 parts down the string, it starts to forget what was put in there originally. So you have to remind it. And so being able to have, as we talked about with, implementing this technology into your HR workforce, is how do you upskill the organization? And I think you bring up a good point. Providing prompts that could be utilized is a fantastic way to upskill your leaders, right? Providing scenarios of what needs to be done. And you can do this by going and just Googling. There's a guy named Ruben Hassid who's got tons of prompts. I think it's a $40 one-time fee. And then you have access to his content library in perpetuity. He sends out a weekly email with tons of information that will help upskill you. And so how do you do this, right? As an HR leader, I would look at the things that I'm doing within my disciplinary action process today. I might go in and look from a policy development perspective and say, how is my disciplinary action policy? Where are the gaps within this policy? How do I drive consistency within this? But the thing that's really important about AI, and especially generative AI and ChatGPT, is the personalization. The more information you give it, the more individualized your response is going to be. So give it information about your organization. You can give it information about your processes, and you can anonymize it, right? You can make sure that it's not, specifically saying this is Evara Health, or this is Target, or this is whatever company. You can make sure you anonymize that so that you have the right information. But from there, you can talk about our process. Where are the gaps? As a good example, one of the things probably the hardest things I've ever done is I had to basically redo our entire sales compensation incentive policy for a previous organization that I was with. Highly complex. I'm not a sales leader, but what I did was I was able to give it that and talk to it about it and look what we were trying to solve and try to find out information. And by the time we got it to legal was like, this is pretty buttoned up. And by the time we got to compensation, same thing. And so it's really, how do you give it that information? How do you tell it what you're trying to solve for? And then how do you use those examples I talked about earlier when utilizing as an intern to give it the right information, give it feedback, ask for multiple responses, and then really start to narrow that down into the answers that you need. And then from there, you can start to create resources or guides that you can provide to your leaders to upskill them and really empower them as people leaders within your organization, which ultimately I think we all want to do, because that allows us to take more administrative tasks off of our plate as HR leaders and take that time and start to focus on more strategic tasks that really start to transform the organization.
What about some basic, let's say, unsexy elements? Let's say we wanted to see data about hours worked per employee and identify if we thought that there was some concerns based on, let's call it hourly, or the number of days that were taken off as PTO, or some other data attribute. Appropriate, applicable, careful what you wish for. You might not, like what you see. How would you, coach some of the people on the call with looking at AI for that application?
Yeah, what I would say in that scenario is it really just depends on the sources that you already have within your organization, right? As an AI, as a department of one, you might not have workforce scheduling tools, or you might not have that level of complexity or aptitude within your organization. And so it's going to be really dependent on the data that you already have. A lot of this might already be built into tools that you utilize. For example, if you use Workday or ADP for scheduling, it might be able to help you in workforce planning or those workforce effectiveness, right? But if you don't, then you might need to figure out how can you use some of the analysis tools that are built into ChatGPT. And to be fair, if you're utilizing the free version of ChatGPT, you're not going to have access to some of these tools. Now, if you pay for the pro version, the 4.4 or 4.0 and above, you do get access to their app store and all these other tools that provide you things like sentiment analysis. A prime example, is similar to what you're talking about in terms of how you use the data is, I used it specifically for sentiment analysis this year when we did our engagement surveys to understand what are the true sentiments, what's the whys behind this. I used it when we started utilizing our annual evaluations to identify, are there sections of our employee base that are in certain diverse populations, or whether they're female or male, that are underpaid. Do we have issues around equitability and compensation? Do we have issues around equitability and how we rate performance of certain populations of employees? And that's what's really easy to do. Even just yesterday, as I'm doing workforce planning with my current organization, I needed to take the entire clinical organization and say, tell me how many people are in each role. Now, I could probably go do that and pull reports and things like that in Excel, and then create a pivot report and make it easy. But I also just threw it into ChatGPT, and in about 35 seconds, it had it listed by which people, which role. And guess what? I wanted it specific to a part of the organization, which made it hard. Everybody under the clinical part of the organization. So that might take some complexity in Excel, but in popping it in ChatGPT, not so complex. In fact, it gives you the answer very quickly, and we'll give you some analysis on that as well.
Well, maybe that relates to a question that's on a lot of people's minds, is the concept of the data sets relevant to the outputs. How is that controlled? How's that influenced? In the general world, when we go to ChatGPT and download something and start entering things, what is its data set versus if we had our own internal purpose data set for an application? How do we guide those?
And I think that's one of the questions I get a lot, right? Is, well, I have these examples of how I asked ChatGPT a question and it didn't give me a real response. In fact, there was a lawyer that was disbarred just last year because they put in ChatGPT, here's my case, I need to prove this point, give me an answer, or give me the data that I need to be able to do this. And then it made up court cases that provided the answer. The key here is you have to understand the true functionality of the tool. The tool is to provide you an answer to the question that you want. Now, if I ask it how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, it might say, hey, Stephen, take 2 pieces of white bread, pop jelly on one side, peanut butter on another, put it together, cut it in half, and then you've got a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. But what if I'm allergic to peanuts? Or what if I want gluten-free bread? Or what if I don't like crust? Or what if you're like my wife and you put, peanut butter on both sides with jelly in the middle? You've got to give it that detail and information. And one of the really cool things about ChatGPT today is the ability to create custom ChatGPT bots. With those bots, you can build the knowledge that you need based on the information that you give it. So a really cool example here is if, for example, you want to go and build a tool for your company for onboarding. You want to be able to give people on-demand opportunities to be able to ask questions about policies or their training plan or whatever it may be. As you build these tools internally, you can adjust and say, do I want it to be able to answer based on collective knowledge of the internet, or do I want it to be built on the data sets that I'm providing it specifically? And it will learn from your feedback the types of answers that are correct for the information that you're seeking. This is a really good call out. Because if you were to build some tool like that, for example, on your own data set, but you wanted it to have the collective knowledge of the internet, you might have an employee who goes in and talks about an open door concern that they have and how do they address that. And they might say, hey, HR bot, I've got a manager who's providing me microaggressions and I feel like I'm being discriminated against for this reason. What should I do? Now, as HR leaders, we want to open up the door for them to come talk to us. We want them to know that we're there to support them. And so when we do that, we make sure that we build it on the knowledge of what we're providing it. Because in this example, if you allowed it to be built off the collective knowledge of the internet, it might tell your employee to go find a lawyer. And we don't want those bots telling them to go find a lawyer because we're here to support them, right? If there's truly discrimination going on, we're going to investigate and we're going to address that accordingly. But you have to make sure, and this is part of the challenges of using AI, that you're building it on really strong data sets, that you're prompting it right, that you're allowing it to learn from you. And there's different functions here, whether using generative AI like ChatGPT to really reduce administrative burdens or to strategize or create ideation versus the deployment of generative AI we talked about earlier, where you're using it based on specific sets of information that you provided it. And so that is really going to be dependent on the strength of your organization when it comes to technology, finances, and aptitude.
So following that, and for my clarity, maybe others also on the call, when you're downloading the ChatGPT from the App Store, which is a suggested great place to self-learn, the data sets associated to that are the internet at large, or define what that is, versus if we were going to engage and partner with our IT departments to install a type of AI service, then part of the setup and configuration of that AI service would be linked to the data sets that are, did we get those two, or did I?
Correct. Yeah, correct. Right. So ChatGPT it's built on Open API. You use API to be able to build that into your own systems, right? You can overlay, for example, a GPT bot into your own system on your HR page to be able to answer HR related questions. Now, you can build that based on your own data warehouse, which is probably the safest way to do that, especially if you have concerns from your legal team or your leadership team around intellectual property or how to make sure that the information is not being, ChatGPT is not learning from your own information. And so you can create these guardrails that make sure that it's built on the data warehouse that you provided only. But when you go into ChatGPT and you're just using it on a day-to-day basis as a tool, if you're going into the application or the website, then you're going to typically be using it, unless you've built a bot that is based solely on the information you provided it, you're going to be using it on the collective information of the internet. So there is a lot of different ways. Again, I'm not the technical, IT guy who will tell you, here's how you go build this tool. But I think what I can tell you is there's a legitimate concern about the information and how it is utilized. And so you have to be able to partner appropriately as HR leaders, because we're not expected to be technically, the leaders of the organization. But I think if you're providing yourself the learning here, you're continuing to learn through continuous learning through, newsletters or working with thought leaders or attending other trainings, it allows you to kind of build your toolbox to be able to work with IT to figure out what is going to be best and to work with your legal team to be what is best. Because ultimately, if you're not utilizing the technology now and you're not utilizing it soon, your company is probably going to be left far behind.
All right, a few minutes left. Steve, any final points from your standpoint?
Yeah, I know we had a couple of questions here that we'll kind of skip over that talked about some of the mental health and things in the workplace. And I'd be more than willing to talk to you guys about any of those questions if you wanted to reach out to me on LinkedIn or have that. But, ultimately what I would say is you're here today because you want to learn. And so continue to use that yearning to grow your ability as an HR leader to make an impact on your organization. Many of us are out here trying to figure out, how do we become more strategic? How do we use information to create actionable insights? How do we go from that transactional administrative part of the organization to one that has a seat at the table? And so I think this is a first step, or maybe a second or third step for many of you. I'm here to support you in some of those conversations that you want to have, and really help you upskill. But I think continue to take that opportunity to learn and figure out how to use it. And like I said, you have to be intentional about how you utilize it every day. One of the best comments I got from somebody last week was somebody who sits on an HR board with me, and she sat through one of my trainings back in October, and she goes, ever since I've sat in that training, I actually log into ChatGPT every day for one reason or another to utilize it, and it's made my job so much easier. And so don't be afraid of it. Ask it questions, learn from others, and figure out how you integrate that into your work today to be more impactful, to be more efficient, and to be more strategic, so that you can elevate the HR role within your organization, so that you can elevate yourself both personally and professionally.
Stephen, fantastic presentation. Thank you very much for spending the time with us all today. I think that it is clear, like the early days when we were being introduced to Netscape and the various foundations of the internet, how we thought they seemed curious, but we all had fax machines and telephones and voice recorders for our phones, and that was the way we were going to communicate. Maybe there was something curious, and of course, as we all saw, what played out was a complete transformation of our both personal and professional lives. And it is likely that this technology and the principles of what Stephen was sharing with us today is likewise going to transform our workplaces, our lives, certainly the lives of our children. These are things that are going to be, a natural part of their world. We'll see how that all plays out in due course. So some just very brief housekeeping. Apologize we couldn't get to all the questions individually, but hopefully the topics and themes were covered. We will send out a follow-up recording of this to everybody, and appreciate you sharing that with others, and certainly sharing and connecting with Stephen's details and information will be available. We will also be including a link to everybody who asked questions either during the call or before, to get a copy of one of the prior books. As a brief heads up, we're going to have Dr. Paul White, who's the best-selling author of Languages of Appreciation, on the virtual workplace WorkProud series. That's going to be February 15th at the same time, so feel free to register for that. But otherwise, everybody, thanks for your attention and interest. Happy Friday. Stephen, all the best to you again. Thanks to you for spending the time with us all today. And again, we'll share and provide contact information post this. All the best, everybody. Be well. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.